Michael Landon, the star, the writer, the producer, the director, my husband, he was carrying a full load.
There is a particular kind of strength that looks, from the outside, like serenity. For nearly half a century, Karen Grassle wore that kind of strength like a second skin. To the millions of Americans who welcomed her into their living rooms every week, she was Caroline Ingalls, Ma, the steady, warm, unshakable heart of Little House on the Prairie. She smiled through every storm the frontier threw at her fictional family. She radiated quiet grace. And when the cameras stopped rolling, she kept right on smiling, kept right on staying quiet, because in the Hollywood of the 1970s, that was the only safe option available to a woman who wanted to keep her career intact. Now, at 82, Karen Grassle has finally stopped smiling through the pain. With the publication of her memoir Bright Lights, Prairie Dust, she has done something that took more courage than any role she ever played. She told the truth. Not a version of it softened for public consumption. Not a carefully curated grievance designed to make headlines. The full, complicated, achingly human truth about what it cost her to be the emotional backbone of one of the most beloved television dramas in American history. And fans, upon hearing it, have been moved to tears, not just by the pain she endured, but by the extraordinary grace with which she endured it. When Karen Grassle was cast as Caroline Ingalls in 1974, she arrived with serious theatrical credentials. Trained at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, she had paid her dues in the world of classical theater before Hollywood came calling. The role of Ma Ingalls was not a minor assignment. It was a cornerstone part in a show that would run for 9 seasons and become embedded in American cultural memory. Week after week, Grassle delivered performances of quiet emotional depth, playing a woman of enormous inner strength who anchored her family through poverty, illness, and loss on the Minnesota frontier. The audience saw her as an icon. The paycheck told a different story. From the beginning of her tenure on the show, Karen's salary bore little resemblance to her contribution to its success. Michael Landon, who served not only as the show's male lead but also as its creator, executive producer, writer, and frequent director, earned exponentially more, a disparity that reflected both his multiple roles and the industry's deeply entrenched double standard when it came to compensating women. For a while, Karen accepted the reality of her situation. She was grateful for the role, committed to the work, and hopeful that her value would eventually be recognized in tangible terms. It wasn't. And when she finally gathered the courage to ask for a raise, professionally, respectfully, without ultimatums or dramatics, the response she received was not fairness. It was retaliation. Scripts began arriving with Caroline scenes trimmed or cut entirely. Dialogue that had once given her character room to breathe, to guide, to feel, was reduced to functional lines barely worth memorizing. The woman who had been the emotional center of the show found herself progressively sidelined in her own story. As Grassle would later write, it felt less like a business decision and more like a punishment. A reminder of who held the power, and what happened to those who forgot it. What made the dynamic between Karen Grassle and Michael Landon particularly difficult was the way it was shrouded in the language of camaraderie. Landon was, by every public account, a charming man, magnetic, funny, the kind of larger-than-life personality around whom entire productions naturally orbit. On screen, he was the embodiment of paternal warmth. Off-screen, according to Grassle's memoir, he wielded that charm with far less benevolence when it suited him. After Karen's request for fair pay, the atmosphere on set shifted in ways that were hard to name but impossible to ignore. Landon's humor, always a dominant force in the production environment, took on an edge when directed her way. In her memoir, Grassle describes moments during filming, including intimate scenes between their characters, when Landon would deliver crude, sexually charged remarks in front of the crew. They weren't offhand slips. They were deliberate performances, calibrated to land with maximum impact in settings where she was already professionally vulnerable. The crew would laugh. What else could they do? And Karen would smile, because what else could she do? This is the dimension of her story that many fans find most difficult to reconcile with the image they carried for decades. The man who played Charles Ingalls, who on screen taught his daughters about dignity and protected his family from every danger, was, in the private world behind the cameras, using humor as a mechanism of control. The jokes were a message, and the message was consistent: you may be on this show, but you serve at my pleasure. Push back, and I will make your daily working life reflect that fact. Karen understood the message. She absorbed it. And she said nothing, because the industry of that era had no safe channel for a woman to say anything at all. Beyond what was directed at her personally, Karen Grassle also found herself witnessing behavior that troubled her for reasons that went beyond her own professional situation. During the run of the show, whispers circulated on set about Michael Landon's relationship with Cindy Clerico, a young stand-in and makeup artist who worked on the production. According to Grassle, those whispers reflected reality. Landon was married at the time, and Clerico was a teenager when the relationship reportedly began, a fact that many on set were quietly aware of and quietly chose to overlook. What struck Karen was not simply the existence of the relationship but the manner in which it was conducted. There was no effort at discretion. Landon behaved, by her account, like a man who had grown so accustomed to operating without consequences that the concept had simply ceased to apply to him. He flirted openly, touched Clerico in front of colleagues, and reportedly joked about his personal life, with the same brazen confidence that defined everything else he did on that set. For Karen, watching this unfold was an education in the mechanics of unchecked power, in how a man who controlled scripts, salaries, and the entire creative direction of a production could also reshape the social norms of the environment he commanded. Landon would eventually leave his wife and later marry Cindy Clerico in 1983. The relationship that had begun in the margins of the Little House set became, in the press coverage of the day, another chapter in the Landon mythology, not a scandal so much as evidence of his irresistible vitality. For Karen, processing this narrative while simultaneously managing the professional consequences of having asked for equal pay was an exercise in a very particular kind of loneliness. By the late 1980s, Little House on the Prairie had been off the air for years. Karen had found some distance from the show and from the complicated emotions its memories carried. She was building a quieter chapter of her life, stepping away from the public eye that had once defined her. And then the news arrived that Michael Landon had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, aggressive, advanced, and terminal. Her reaction was not what she might have expected. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of justice finally arriving. What she felt was something she hadn't anticipated: grief and a complicated ache that had no clean name. Out of that feeling, she did something remarkable. She sat down and wrote him a letter. Not to confront him, not to list the injuries he had done her, not to demand acknowledgement of anything. She wrote to thank him for casting her, for the role that had touched millions of lives, for the years of work they had shared. She wrote of forgiveness. She sealed the envelope and sent it without expectation of a response. Word reached her later, through a mutual acquaintance, that Landon had received the letter and wept. Those 3 words, "he had wept," were enough. They couldn't undo the years of silence she had kept or give back the scenes that had been taken from her or neutralize the sting of jokes told at her expense. But they were a form of acknowledgement that transcended anything a formal apology might have offered. 2 people who had shared a stage and damaged each other, meeting briefly across the chasm of mortality, in something that looked, quietly, privately, like grace. When Bright Lights, Prairie Dust was published in 2021, it did not arrive with the noise of a scandal sheet. It was a measured, thoughtful, beautifully written account of a life fully lived, one that included great joy and great pain in nearly equal measure. Grassle did not position Michael Landon as a villain. She positioned him as a contradiction, a man of genuine creative brilliance and real generosity who was also capable of pettiness, cruelty, and the casual abuse of power. It was precisely this refusal to flatten him into a simple antagonist that gave the memoir its emotional authority. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Fans who had grown up with Little House on the Prairie as a symbol of wholesome American family life were confronted with the human cost of that image. The warmth they had always associated with Ma Ingalls, they now understood, had been generated partly in spite of the conditions behind the scenes. Grassle's restraint, the fact that she delivered these revelations without malice and without a call for vengeance struck readers as genuinely remarkable. It made the story harder to dismiss and harder to forget. Other voices began to emerge in the wake of the memoir. Former cast members and crew who had maintained their silence for decades spoke up, corroborating aspects of the environment Grassle had described. The picture that emerged was of a production defined by Landon's enormous talent and equally enormous authority, a place where his word was final, his humor was law, and challenging either came at a professional price. None of this erased the genuine affection many felt for him. But it complicated the image in ways the public was, at last, willing to sit with. What Karen Grassle's story ultimately reveals is the extraordinary psychological toll of enforced silence and the equally extraordinary power of finally breaking it. For decades, she carried the weight of experiences she had never been permitted to name. The industry she worked in, the era she worked in, and the specific power dynamics she navigated had all conspired to make silence the only survivable option. She had done what countless women before her and after her have done, smiled through the interviews, showed up on set, delivered her performances, and kept the truth locked somewhere safe inside herself. The decision to write the memoir was not an act of revenge. It was an act of self-reclamation. At 82, Karen Grassle has nothing left to protect except her own integrity and her own story. In writing Bright Lights, Prairie Dust, she gave herself back something that had been quietly taken from her across decades of professional silence, the right to be the author of her own narrative. The response from women across industries and generations confirmed what she perhaps already sensed: her experience was not unique to Hollywood, not unique to the 1970s, not unique to television production. The mechanics of professional silencing that she endured are as familiar to women in offices and hospitals and classrooms as they are on film sets. Karen Grassle did not set out to reshape Michael Landon's legacy. But in telling her truth, she inevitably expanded it. He remains what he always was, a visionary creator who gave American audiences something genuine and lasting. But now, that image coexists with the more complicated reality of the man behind it. This is not a diminishment. It is, if anything, a more honest form of respect, the recognition that great work and flawed humanity are not mutually exclusive, and that pretending otherwise does a disservice to everyone involved, including those who suffered in the margins of the greatness. What endures most powerfully from Grassle's story is not the pain, though the pain is real. It is the grace. The grace of a woman who chose, in the face of humiliation and inequity, to keep doing excellent work. The grace of a woman who, at the moment she heard her tormentor was dying, chose to write him a letter of forgiveness rather than a letter of accusation. The grace of a woman who waited until she could tell the truth without bitterness, and then told it anyway, clearly and without apology. At 82, Karen Grassle has given fans something more lasting than nostalgia. She has given them a model of what it looks like to reclaim your own story, and to do so with your dignity not just intact, but deepened by every year it took to find the right words.